Well, I mean, I think the national and the global are very related. So I think many, and this is why things like the fantasy shield are so helpful to think about what that relationship might be. The concept of hegemony, the idea that there are certain things that are so taken for granted that you can't really talk about them. Well, what happens when hegemony starts to crumble? When you actually start talking about things that were true without having to be named. And one of those things, for example, is the dominance of the idea of the nation state, that the ideal way that states are constituted is as nations, and they relate to each other as nation states. And that starts to crumble with everything from the development of an international rules-based order, but then most obviously in things like the EU, where the nation state as the thing that we should all assume we have is really not so obvious. What things are regional, what things are national, what things are global, what things are EU specific. You get a discussion of what does it mean to be part of Europe? What is Europe? Where are the boundaries of Europe? What does Europeness mean? Is there such a thing as a European citizen? And those are all interesting questions, but they're also a crumbling of the hegemony of the nation state. And when the nation state hegemony crumbles, so too do, I think, a lot of the assumptions about the nation state as a gendered entity.
But I also think the global circulation of ideas is really important in the sense that you have it happens on two layers. One is the official president to president, leader to leader, where they are teaching each other. I'm absolutely convinced that Erdogan, when he stages a coup in Ankara, he is watching what Putin is doing in Moscow. So they're talking at that global level of what nation states should be doing. And then the other thing that's so interesting is underneath that are the ways in which the World Council of Families and other right-wing groups are teaching each other to say homophobia, homosexuality is the great danger to Europe. In Russia, Europe is called gay Europa because, oh my God, they're all gay, decadent. And instead of, they're people who love each other, right? So we have to keep, the liberals have to constantly work to reframe this sort of almost tsunami, this tidal wave of right-wing imagining that is being borrowed from nation to nation. So it's not accidental that nations that, there are of course, many nations care deeply about abortion because of their Catholic past. Poland is a great example. That is a touchstone issue and has been for a long time, but others didn't care about abortion. Russia, abortion was perfectly legal and perfectly normal for the entire Soviet period. But they take up abortion politics when Putin has his conservative turn in 2012. It's Western influence, I'm convinced. It's European, it's American ideas. They're meeting, they're talking, they're imagining this pure, natural order where there's men and there's women and nobody's trans and nobody's non-binary. Who's teaching whom? I think that's the other thing that's so interesting to me about these ideas is to understand the surface. How does the past get reimagined? There's so much, but then how do we get under that? And the global connections, I think, are really fascinating.
I think it's very different country to country and even place to place. I mean, why and how young men and which young men are recruited to right-wing ideas. In the US, that discourse is sometimes called the red pill discourse, based on a science fiction story in which people got to swallow a red pill that stripped the illusions from their eyes and they could see what was really going on. And that kind of thinking that you will see what's really going on somehow is the underlying conspiracy theory or the scary part of some of this. And that, I think, is very tied to the idea among some young men that what they were taught about their entitlements in life, what masculinity would mean for them, is not going to be real in their lives. And the reality is that the social relations are changing. When I say that, people jump to the conclusion that I think, oh yes, gender equality has been achieved and nothing could be further from my mind. But gender relations are something that's always being renegotiated in one way or another. And at the moment, the way that gender relations are being renegotiated means that young women are seeing education as a route into social power, economic power. Women, particularly minoritized women, are really embracing education. And young men are seeing that as scary because they don't do as well in educational things, in part because the vision of masculinity that has been around stresses brawn over brain. We really do not need male muscles to the extent that we once did as a society, as a global economy. And that's not really a reassuring message for young men. In the US, we see that especially evident in the turn towards gun ownership. In Germany, you don't have that same gun culture, but you do have established right-wing youth constituency. And Cynthia Idris Muller has done some beautiful work on the ways in which young men who are in those kind of brawn jobs, and even among some of those young men with immigrant backgrounds, the notion that they would be out working in what they saw as demeaning positions. So the young men who were most attracted to the right were the young men who were in jobs as mortarers, plasterers, scaffold builders, who would be obviously doing manual work in public. And that somehow reflected badly on them, that they were a lower class. And they turned right and were very easily recruited to this sort of Nordic superiority, racist stuff. But the idea that the masculinity that they were led to expect would give them privilege isn't working anymore that way. So loss of status, loss of economic power or relative economic power, it shifts who can depend on masculinity.
Russia's a very strange animal in terms of populism. On the one hand, it doesn't have populist parties. It has the main party, United Russia, is really a machine politics. Putin has a pseudo-populism. He doesn't actually want popular movements. So what he creates are movements around militarism and patriotism. So there's a ton of very scary youth movements that follow a Soviet pattern where they send the kids to camps where they learn to shoot at targets. They're not allowed to have guns. It's not like the US, thank goodness, but it's still militarized, masculinized, and made patriotic with this appeal to higher emotions. And so people perform this involvement in really what's a state masculinism, and that helps tamp things down. I will say that I saw recent statistics survey data on who Russians think, I mentioned this in my paper, who Russians think is the most inspiring figure to them. And they could name anyone. They weren't given a list of who to choose. They chose who to list. And all ages put Putin first, but they often listed many people. And Navalny came in second for almost all age groups. And for 25 to 35-year-olds, it was equal. Putin and Navalny, the opposition figure. So there's a way in which that martyring self for the greater good, which was a Soviet value, still appeals. Typically, it's the oldest generation that's the most pro-Putin. Young people are kind of split. There's a more right-wing view, and then there's a more world-traveling view that says, hey, this is really silly. Why shouldn't we have gay pride? When the January 6th happened, one of the people who took a leading role, his online name was Rufio. It happens to be, Rufio is a name from Peter Pan from the movie with Robin Williams called Hook. And Rufio is Peter Pan's like second in command. So talk about fantasies.
The Oath Keepers and the 3%ers, their particular idea is they're the ones who maintain their oath to the Constitution that this is not a democracy, this is a republic. And they're true to the real notion of what the American dream was, which is not that all these other people should come in, or the 3%ers. Only 3%, according to their mythology, were willing to rise up in the revolution and kick out the British. And they're among that 3%. So this sort of fantasy of we are the authentic, real past, we are the ones, it's quite different than all of the, say, anti-masker stuff in Germany or other kinds of resistance. I think it really is helpful to distinguish among the different kinds of fantasies. And the only reference to that I made in my own talk was the question of, here's this fantasy in the US of these revolutionary, we're warning you, you sheeple, you need to be aroused, right? And the German image of, we have the Jewish star, we are the victims, we are the noble, we are all going to be killed if we follow what people tell us to do. We are going to be headed off as vaccinated people to be exterminated. But it's still this sense of survival is at stake. It's a very high-powered kind of thing. Not all of what I would say internationally is the rise of the right wing, is that kind of high-powered, we are really facing a struggle over survival.
Well, I was just going to say one other quick thing about the US, which is the rise of a fascination with history, I think is a very good thing. Because I think even though the right and liberal versions of the history are very, very different, they can engage with each other. You can have a debate over what really happened, and it becomes harder and harder to ignore the past the way it used to be clamped down.
Well, I have very modest goals. I just want to bring gender into the discussion about populism, to get people to realize, especially among sociologists and political scientists, who very easily accept the language of things like traditional families or traditional democracy or the traditional ways of life of rural America. And tradition comes to stand for, we don't have to look at the history.
Exactly.
And so I have been notorious, even among my graduate students, for striking out the word traditional wherever it sneaks in, traditional gender arrangements or traditional whatever, and insisting that they say conventional rather than traditional.
And I would say I'm excited that political scientists in particular are finally acknowledging the role of emotions. They're finally looking at geography and spaces and performances, which for so long was taboo. And like Myra, I want them to unpack words like legitimacy. Putin showed his legitimacy. No. He showed his power, and power is different than legitimacy, and we need to unpack that. But above all, I feel that, and I'm sure you've discovered this too, Victoria, once you see masculinity, it shifts the whole picture. But it's really, Althusser said this so many decades ago, it's invisible until you see it. And so the more we can get people to see those structures that influence us, we are deeply emotional animals, and we are influenced by the ways things are presented to us unconsciously. So we need to be able to name them, see race where it is, see gender where it is, and then see it in all its variations. And I think that's also very, very important, that it is different in each of these countries, but that mutual influences and so on.